Hi, everybody. I'm back with another very brief video. And in this video, I wanted to talk to you about research questions and hypotheses. Typically, you're going to end your introduction section of an article with your research questions and hypotheses. Now, the research questions should read either in a formal sense or an informal sense what you're trying to study. I typically write my research questions as a question, which makes it easier for the reader to understand what I'm asking. Now, it is possible to also write your research questions in sentence form and list them out. So what I'm showing you here is oftentimes used for theses, dissertations, and experimental reports in classrooms, but it isn't necessarily the only way to do it. So when in doubt, follow the guidelines of the journal that you're looking to publish in, follow the guidelines of your professor, and so forth. But before I go into the document that I'm going to put on the screen, I also want to talk to you about what hypotheses are. So hypotheses are linked to that which you think is going to happen in your study. And there are two common hypotheses that are written. There's the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, which people refer to as your research hypotheses. So when you think about a null hypothesis, think about the phrase null and void. Nothing doing, canceled out. So the null hypothesis, if the null hypothesis were true, you would state that there is no statistically significant differences or relationship between the groups in your study. And if there are differences that occur in your study, it's likely due to chance or error variance. Whereas the research hypothesis, also known as the alternative hypothesis, is that if it wasn't due to chance, it was due to your manipulation. So oftentimes, the research hypothesis is actually what you state, and you make it clear that's what you're looking to have happen in the study. So I'm going to do a brief screen share. And I took this off of my dissertation, which was many moons ago, or if some people might say not so many moons ago, but this is 7 years ago. But nevertheless, I think it's a good model for you. So let me share my screen, and you should be seeing a document that says research questions and hypotheses. And you're framing the end of your introduction so that the reader remembers. Now, in another video, I talked to you about how to write the first few paragraphs in the introduction. And I discussed things like capturing their attention with a thesis statement. And in that thesis statement, you'll say the purpose of the research study is to ... But afterwards, you're going to review a lot of literature and whatnot. So people might forget what your goals were, or what your questions were. So it's advisable to restate it after you have your research questions hypotheses to say the following research questions were derived from the research on substance use, behavior, and religiosity in a Jewish community. So what's interesting is substance use or substance abuse are behaviors. So you're being very clear about what you're doing. Now, your sentence will look somewhat different based on what you're looking to accomplish. But nevertheless, after you do that, you write research question 1 and listen to how it's written. How is self-perceived Jewish religious identification associated with drug and alcohol use as measured by the Dudit E? Now, notice in the research questions, you're talking about your independent variable, you're talking about your dependent variable, and you're talking about your population. It's very similar to the title page. The person should have a clear understanding about how you're measuring this. So I did add some parenthetical things, which I skipped over for brevity, but it says, as reported in the Jewish denominational groups items on the demographics questionnaire. So I'm telling the reader, well, how am I going to determine one's self-reported or self-perceived Jewish religious identification? Well, they're going to identify on a question as Orthodox, conservative, reform, unaffiliated. There are choices in a demographics questionnaire. So I also tell you how I'm going to measure drug and alcohol use, and I mention it that I'm tapping into it using the Dudit E. And in the study, it was a modified version that included alcohol as well. All right. So the null hypothesis, as you recall, I said the null hypothesis was that there's nothing doing. Any change, any differences or any changes due to error. So the null hypothesis is stated as follows: drug and alcohol usage means will not differ between Jewish denominational groups. Now, you could write that differently and say there will be no statistically significant differences in drug and alcohol usage means across the groups. That's another way to write it. But in my dissertation chair wanted me to be as specific as possible. So you'll see that I'm putting a little extra into this. So the null hypothesis, the biggest thing that I'm trying to emphasize, and I'm going to bold and underline it right now, but it shouldn't be formatted that way, is they will not differ, right? They will not differ significantly. And we use statistics to determine that. Well, the alternative hypothesis or the research hypothesis is that there will be an inverse relationship between drug and alcohol usage means and Jewish identification. Namely, the Orthodox drug and alcohol mean scores will be lower than conservative, reform, and unaffiliated mean scores, right? So that would be clear. So I'm saying there's going to be some difference. And namely, I don't have to add that, but if you want to have a directional hypothesis, you might include things like, namely, Orthodox drug and alcohol mean scores will differ significantly. Now, the second research question was, is self-reported Jewish identity, is self-perceived Jewish identity as reported in a Jewish denominational groups item on a demographics questionnaire consistent with adherence to Jewish concepts and precepts as measured by the SRQ? Now, it's interesting. I had to ask this question because it is possible that a person could say, yeah, I'm Orthodox, but not keep to Orthodox standards in belief and practice. So one's self-perception might be inconsistent with their actions. So the second research question was designed to tap into any kind of noise in the data or inconsistency. So the null hypothesis, self-perceived Jewish identity will be inconsistent with adherence to Jewish concepts and precepts. If there's no linkage, then you expect there to be people who say I'm Orthodox but aren't, right? So you expect there to be error. So namely, there will be no difference in SRQ precept and concept scores across the Jewish denominational group. So the mean scores would not differ significantly, right? So again, the null hypothesis, you're seeing the emphasis, no difference, right? So I like to, and my writing has changed since I wrote my dissertation. I like to say there will be no statistically significant differences, because there might be some differences, but if it doesn't reach the threshold of statistical significance, then it doesn't matter, right? So that would be the null hypothesis, again, nothing doing. The research hypothesis in this context is self-perceived Jewish identity will be consistent with adherence to Jewish concepts and precepts. So I'm saying that if you say you're Orthodox, you're going to have higher mean scores on SRQ precept and concepts. So notice the second sentence is, namely, Orthodox SRQ precept and concept mean scores will be higher than conservative, reform, and unaffiliated mean scores. So you're telling the reader exactly what you're looking for, right? Go to research question 3. So research question 3 is, how is self-perceived Jewish identity reported on the demographics questionnaire, linked to or associated with the desire to present oneself in an overly favorable light, as measured by the MCSDS, Marlowe-Crown Social Desirability Score. Now, I mentioned to you in a previous lecture that when you are dealing with taboos and people fill out surveys, they could be prone to lie. And measuring in the Orthodox Jewish population is tricky, because they have religious standards to uphold, and it's very community-based. So they might misrepresent both their level of practice, as well as they might misrepresent their amount of substance use they engage in. So to eliminate the possibility that social desirability is why we got differences, we have to test for that. So the null hypothesis is that there will be no difference in social desirability scores across the groups. Again, I wrote it differently on my dissertation. The research hypothesis is that increased Jewish identification will result in higher social desirability scores. Namely, Orthodox MCSDS means will be higher than conservative, reform, and unaffiliated, right? So in this context, I'm telling the reader, I anticipate greater levels of social desirability among the more traditional of the groups. Now, so keep in mind what we've done so far. We've tested whether there are differences between substance use and one's category of religious group. We've linked one's religious identification with their belief and practices. We've eliminated or measured for or addressed the possibility that social desirability could be at play. So I still need to determine whether there is a significant effect even after addressing these factors. So the final research question is, does social desirability moderate the relationship between self-perceived Jewish identity and self-disclosed substance use scores, right? So now I'm looking for whether the relationship continues to exist even after you eliminate social desirability. Does it moderate? So the null hypothesis says social desirability will not moderate the association between self-perceived Jewish identity and substance abuse. The research hypothesis is that individuals with the strongest Jewish identification will also have higher social desirability scores, and they will likely disclose less substance abuse than weaker Jewish identification and lower social desirability scores. Now, there is a difference between mediating and moderating variables, which when you have a moderation model, you're acknowledging that there is an existing relationship between two factors, but that third factor could either enhance or dilute the existing relationship. And that's why in my research hypothesis, I had to say those with the strongest Jewish identification will have enhanced social desirability scores, or even accounting for that, they're going to have lower substance abuse scores. So I'm taking that relationship and saying, hey, it's, this difference between identification and reported substance use is going to be enhanced due to social desirability to some degree. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what did I find in my study? I did find that at the extremes, there were differences in substance use. Orthodox Jews used significantly less drugs than unaffiliated Jews. Now, what was cool, so that hypothesis was supported. What was cool about this study was that for conservative and reform Jews, they didn't have significant differences in substance abuse. And because of that, I argued in my dissertation in the discussion section that it's possible that religion serves a protective role even in non-Orthodox communities, right? Now, the second hypothesis, I wanted to know if your self-reported identification matched your scores on SRQ. That we found was consistent. So we know that the groups that we used are credible. So now Orthodox, conservative, reform, and unaffiliated categories, they had differences in belief and practice, and it was demonstrated. So the second hypothesis was also supported, the research hypothesis. The third hypothesis was also supported insofar as Orthodox Jews tended to have higher rates of social desirability. And we know that. What I have found was interesting, though, is that Reform Jews in my sample also had significantly high social desirability mean scores. And I spent months trying to figure out, well, why is it that the Reform Jews in my study also had higher social desirability? And then I realized that where I was collecting data, there were a large number of Orthodox synagogues. There were a large number of conservative synagogues. There was only one Reform synagogue. So it could have been an anxiety factor that they were dishonoring the synagogue they belonged to, or it was easier to identify who they were. And then for unaffiliated individuals, I went to the Jewish Community Center and collected data there. So a large number of people. So I came to the conclusion that Reform Jews were more socially desirable in the sample because of the fact that there was only one synagogue that represented them in that area. Lastly, I did find a significant regression analysis. So even after we accounted for social desirability, religious belief and practice was a statistically significant predictor of the rates of substance use. So you might say, oh, well, maybe Orthodox Jews, they lied in the study, so that's why they had lower scores on substance use. But you can't say that, because I used a regression analysis to determine whether that effect held or was maintained even after I partialed out the effect of social desirability. So that was pretty cool. So long story short, this is my discussion about research questions and hypotheses. I hope you have a better understanding on what a research question is, what the difference is between a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. And I hope that this gave you some sense of how to write it for your introduction section. I will tell you, you could write all of these questions more simplistically. You know what? Why don't I do that as well on this video? So I could shrink all of these questions and hypotheses and it would still be adequate. How is self-perceived religious identification associated with drug and alcohol use? Right? So if I wanted to, I could theoretically shrink it to that, and that would still be an okay question. Well, now I mentioned, well, why did I write it the way I did? Because in a dissertation, my dissertation chair required me to have incredible specificity. And your professor may not. In an undergraduate class or a master's level class, I personally don't require that level of specificity. And you could shrink the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. So to make it shorter, so you don't have to have filler. So I stated the question. The null hypothesis is drug and alcohol usage mean scores will not differ between Jewish denominational groups. The research or alternative hypothesis, the Orthodox drug and alcohol mean scores will be lower. Notice it's straight to the point, less noise. And then the second research question is also can be shrunk. Again, you could eliminate the citation if you wanted, because you're going to talk about the instruments in the method section, right? So I'm going to shrink my second research question the way I write it today. Is self-reported Jewish identity consistent with adherence to Jewish concepts and precepts, right? So that is a much shorter question. And then the null hypothesis, again, there will be no difference in precept and concept scores across the groups, much shorter, right? The alternative hypothesis, again, I'm shrinking it. I'm going to upload this to the files section as well for your benefit. Orthodox SRQ precept and concept means will be higher than conservative reform and unaffiliated. Now, research question 3, let's bring that up. There's a spacing issue. How is self-perceived Jewish identity associated with the desire to present oneself in a socially desirable light? All right, now we'll say there will be no difference in social desirability mean scores. That would be fine. And then the alternative hypothesis is Orthodox social desirability means will be higher. Now, does it moderate the relationship between self-reported Jewish identity and substance use? You could say social desirability will not moderate the association. Good. That doesn't even need to be touched. And then you could say individuals with it, this one doesn't need to be touched. So notice how I shrunk the questions as well. So you can ask the question in a generic way, or you could be more specific. I encourage you to rely on what your professor wants from you, or what a journal wants for you if you're using this as guidance for publication purposes. So I'm going to stop the recording here.